There comes a point in life when people stop announcing what they feel, not because they have nothing to say, but because they've learned how little it changes. You begin to notice it in small ways, conversations that end sooner, reactions that soften, opinions that are no longer offered. It doesn't look like distance at first. It looks like calm. If any part of this feels familiar, stay with me for a moment. You may recognize more than you expect. Somewhere in the later chapters of life, people begin to adjust their energy in ways that are almost invisible. Not dramatic withdrawals, not sudden disappearances, but quiet recalibrations. The kind that only makes sense when you've spent decades giving, explaining, negotiating, and trying. One of the first things that changes is how often they correct others. In earlier years, they might have felt the need to clarify misunderstanding, to defend their intentions, to make sure they were seen accurately. But over time, something shifts. They begin to let things stand as they are. Misinterpretations go unchallenged. Assumptions are no longer dismantled, not because they agree, but because they no longer feel the need to be understood at all costs. You may hear them say less in conversations that used to matter deeply. Family discussions, once filled with opinions and emotional investment, become quieter. They listen more. They respond less. And when they do speak, it's often measured, almost detached. This isn't indifference. It's a form of conservation, a decision, often unconscious, that not every moment deserves their emotional involvement. Another subtle change appears in how they handle disappointment. In younger years, disappointment could linger, expand, even reshape relationships. But later in life, disappointment becomes smaller, more contained. They don't ignore it, but they don't build around it either. They adjust expectations instead, quietly, without announcement. There's also a noticeable shift in how they initiate contact. They may stop being the first to call, the first to check in, the first to repair distance, not out of resentment, but out of recognition. Relationships begin to reveal themselves more clearly when effort is no longer one-sided. And rather than chasing connection, they step back and observe what remains. At times, this can be misunderstood as withdrawal or coldness, but often it's neither. It's clarity, the kind that comes from years of repeated patterns finally settling into something undeniable. If you've ever found yourself remembering how things used to be, how conversations flowed more easily, how people reached out without hesitation, pause there for a moment. Notice the feeling that comes with that memory. Not just nostalgia, but something quieter. A realization that not everything fades because it's broken. Some things simply reach their natural end. Stay with that thought, because recognizing it changes how you see everything that follows. Another pattern begins to emerge in how they respond to conflict. They no longer escalate. They rarely insist. In fact, they often allow disagreements to pass without resolution. This isn't avoidance in the usual sense. It's an understanding that not all conflicts lead to growth. Some only repeat themselves, and after enough repetition, the outcome becomes predictable enough to step away before it even unfolds. Their tolerance for emotional noise decreases. Loud reactions, dramatic expressions, unnecessary tension, these things begin to feel heavier than they once did. Not because they can't handle them, but because they no longer see the value in carrying them. Peace becomes less negotiable. You might also notice a shift in how they define closeness. It becomes less about frequency and more about quality. They may speak to fewer people, but the conversations that remain are quieter, more grounded, and often shorter. There's less performance, less need to impress or maintain a certain image. What remains is more honest, even if it's less frequent. And then there's the way they begin to let go of roles they once held tightly. The mediator in the family, the one who fixes everything, the one who remembers birthdays, organizes gatherings, smooths tensions. Over time, these roles begin to loosen. Not because they no longer care, but because they've started to question whether those roles were ever sustainable to begin with. At this stage, something deeper is happening beneath all these small changes. It's not just behavioral, it's psychological, a quiet restructuring of priorities. For decades, much of life is shaped by responsibility. Raising children, maintaining relationships, building stability, proving reliability. There's a constant outward orientation, but as those responsibilities shift or diminish, attention begins to turn inward. Not in a selfish way, but in a reflective one. People begin to ask different questions. Not, what should I do next? But, what still feels true to me? How do I maintain this connection? But is this connection still mutual? This is where many misunderstand the process. From the outside, it can look like detachment, but from within, it often feels like alignment. There's also an increasing awareness of time, not in a dramatic sense, but in a practical one. Energy is no longer treated as unlimited. Emotional investment becomes more selective. People begin to notice where their presence is reciprocated, where it is simply tolerated, and where it is quietly taken for granted. And with that awareness comes a kind of boundary that doesn't need to be spoken. They don't always explain why they step back. They simply do. This is also the stage where silence becomes more meaningful than explanation. Instead of long conversations trying to repair or redefine relationships, they allow space to reveal what words no longer can. And often that space says enough. As this continues, something else emerges, an unexpected sense of calm, not constant, not perfect, but present in moments where there used to be tension. Decisions become simpler, reactions become slower. There's less urgency to fix, to respond, to engage. But this calm is often built on something deeper than acceptance. It's built on experience, years of seeing how things unfold, how people change or don't, and eventually, that experience leads to a quiet conclusion. Not everything needs to be held onto. If you've been listening and recognizing pieces of your own life in this, there's something important to understand. These changes are not signs of loss. They are signs of refinement. And if this reflection has brought up even a small moment of recognition for you, let it stay with you a little longer. You don't need to act on it immediately. Just notice it. Because what often follows this stage is not isolation, but a different kind of connection. One that is quieter, more intentional, and far less demanding. In these later years, relationships are no longer maintained out of obligation. They are chosen. And that choice carries a different kind of weight, one that doesn't rely on history alone, but on present-day reality. You may find that conversations become more direct, but also more limited. There is less patience for surface-level interactions, but a deeper appreciation for sincerity. People begin to value those who understand without needing explanation. And perhaps most importantly, there is a growing comfort with being alone, not as a fallback, but as a valid and even necessary state. Solitude stops feeling like something to fix and starts feeling like something to protect. This doesn't mean loneliness disappears. It doesn't, but it changes shape. It becomes less about who is absent and more about what is meaningful. In the end, what you see on the surface, less talking, less reacting, less reaching out, is only part of the story. Beneath it is a careful, often unspoken decision to live with greater clarity. And that clarity doesn't always look warm or expressive. Sometimes it looks like distance. Sometimes it looks like silence. But if you look closely, it's neither. It's a form of self-respect that took decades to build, and not everyone recognizes it when they see it. If this reflection stayed with you until the end, then perhaps it touched something you've been quietly noticing in your own life. Focus Theory thanks you for listening and being part of this reflection. There is no need to rush what you're beginning to understand. Some realizations are meant to unfold slowly, just like everything else that truly lasts.